All right, back on the morning drive on this Thursday morning. Glad to have with us this morning Senator Johnny Isakson joining us on the morning drive. Senator Isakson, good morning. How are you?
Good morning, Chris. Great to be with you.
Thank you so much for being with us this morning. And first, we'll also tell folks you'll be actually here in town. You're joining us this morning from Atlanta, but I know you'll be in town here in Valdosta next week, correct?
That's correct, on the 30th of May.
We're looking forward to your visit here, and I know we want to go over several topics with you this morning. First of all, let's start with the CBO report, which came out earlier this week, talking about the tremendous problem that the United States could be facing if the Bush-era tax cuts are allowed to expire. I know you've listened to that survey, seen that study. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, you know, the tax rates have been in place for 10 years. To have them go up at a time we're still in a trough in terms of the recession would be a depressant on the economy. We have pretty anemic growth at 2%. If you add an increase in taxes to that with no other reforms or no other incentives anywhere, you're probably going to cause a double-dip recession. And with unemployment around the United States at 8.2, but in Georgia at 8.7, we don't need that to happen. What we need is a comprehensive reform of our tax code, cutting of spending by the discretionary spending by the Congress, and reform of our entitlements.
You've been pretty outspoken about having a simpler tax system. Can and that's a kind of a loaded question to ask you to explain exactly because it's pretty complex. But in essence, what would you like to see happen with the tax system?
Well, I think the Simpson-Bowles Commission had the right approach, where you just take all of the tax preferences or tax deductions or tax expenditures, investment tax credits, depreciation, all those types of things. You pull those back and you take the money that generates and you use it to lower the rate of taxation. So you have a simpler application of the tax code. The Simpson-Bowles estimated that if you did that, you'd go from a top corporate rate of 35% to 26 to 29%, which would be a huge reduction in the rate of taxation, but the amount of revenue would stay the same because you did away with the deductions, and then with the lower tax rate, you'd incentivize growth in the economy. Every time it's happened in the last 50 years, from John Kennedy to George W. Bush, when they did that, exactly that same thing happened. Revenues went up, not down. And
you've been a co-sponsor of the Fair Tax Act, which would, again, shift tax to a more revenue-neutral personal consumption tax on all retail sales of goods and services, as opposed to personal income tax, corporate income tax, things of that nature.
I have always favored consumption taxes over productivity taxes. To tax productivity is a disincentive for productivity itself. To tax consumption, somebody is paying based on their willingness to spend, not on their productivity, and that's a far fairer way to do it.
Senator Isakson, you've also been pretty outspoken about your disappointment in the Senate not passing a budget, and talked about the importance of passing a budget. Is it frustrating for the Republican side as a Republican senator to see that not being done in the Senate?
Well, you know, I'm a regular average Georgian like all of your listeners, and I've had to tighten my belt over the last 4 or 5 years. My wife and I have had to change our budget. American families have had to do it all over the economy. And to think our government has now gone through over 3 years without a budget being approved by Congress, that's just disappointing. We have spent, Chris, $10.4 trillion in those 3 years without a budget. That's why you have the runaway spending. You have no discipline and control.
Now, when we talk about budget cuts, and I know it's of particular interest to a lot of folks in our listening area, is when we talk about budget cuts, how much of that will affect our military? Of course, Moody Air Force Base, a strong economic engine here in our area, and certainly we think vital to the nation as well. When you start balancing that out and looking at where you can cut, how bad do you think the military will fare?
Well, if you do the automatic sequestration, which the president has proposed, it's going to hurt the military by another $550 billion over the next 10 years, and you add that to the $460 billion that were cut from the military last year, that's over $1 trillion, and we will not be able to sustain our presence around the world or even our presence domestically with those kind of cuts. Defense has to share part of the burden, and winding down Afghanistan is going to help, but you can't do it solely on the back of defense. In fact, I'll give you an interesting figure. The deficit last year was $1.5 trillion. That was the deficit. All discretionary spending, including the military, was $1.182 trillion. So if you cut out every dime you spend on every government program in the entire military, you still would not have had a balanced budget. because of entitlements. 2/3 of all expenditures of the government go to Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, SSI, disability, aid to family and dependent children, food stamps, and things like that. That's where we need some substantial reform to bring down our spending.
And I think that's what, and we've said often on this show, I think that's what people are really against. It's not necessarily being against taxes. We understand that there are government services which are needed, but people are against excessive tax and also wasteful spending. And when you talk about entitlement programs like that, everybody, when you say, well, let's cut taxes, everybody's for that, but they just don't want you to cut their particular program.
Well, that's correct. And in terms of entitlements, I want to be sure the listeners understand that Medicare and Social Security are not an entitlement. They're a contract that the taxpayers have with the United States government. Every citizen has paid 1.35% of their income into the Medicare Trust Fund for the last 44 years. Everybody's paid 6.2% of their income in payroll taxes to go into Social Security. They deserve that contract, and they deserve those benefits. But if we don't reform the way we're paying them out, if we don't reform the eligibility dates with times having changed like they have, then the system is going to run out of money, and we're going to not be able to pay people what they deserve and what they paid for. Other entitlements, such as Medicaid, such as SSI disability, such as food stamps, such as AFDC, retirement benefits, and things like that, we're going to have to do in the government what the companies around the United States have done, and that's tighten their belt and reform those entitlements.
Also, I know you talked about, and I'm sure you'll probably hit on this next week when you're actually here in Valdosta, federal issues that affect South Georgia businesses. Can you expound a little bit about exactly what some of those issues are? You
mean the regulatory issues?
Yes.
Well, what you've had with the government in the last 3.5 years is the president had success in the first 2 years passing stuff through the Congress, like Obamacare and things like that, but there was a huge reaction by the people at the polls in 2010. So since 2010, the administration has really tried to legislate through regulation. One good example that would have had a huge effect on South Georgia was the Labor Department's regulation, which they finally pulled back last week, saying you had to be 18 years old to work on a farm, even if you're working on your own family farm, which you couldn't even take agriculture classes or 4-H classes in school until you were 18 years old. That was just a reach of the government into the family farm that made no sense whatsoever. There are a lot of other regulations in terms of water, in terms of pesticides, in terms of agricultural products, but the government is over-regulating the American farmer and American productivity in agriculture.
And Senator Isakson, I think when our listeners hear that, the proposal which you just mentioned about the 4-H programs and working on the family farm, it tells them, boy, our government and the leadership in this country is just totally out of touch with the common everyday American citizen, because that proposal makes zero sense.
Well, as a farmer told me last week on a telephone call, it's not the government's business to run my family, it's the government's business to protect my family.
Very good point. Senator Johnny Isakson joining us this morning. You mentioned Obamacare. Of course, the Supreme Court will likely render a decision, or at least on part of the constitutionality of Obamacare coming up probably here in the next 4 or 5 weeks. Any predictions, or what do you feel that they'll find as they've looked at that case?
Well, I don't know what they're going to do, and I don't like making predictions, but I do trust the judgment of a lot of people I know who are good constitutional lawyers, and most of them feel like they're probably going to split the baby in half and rule against the individual mandate under the Commerce Clause, which means forcing everybody to buy a specified product. But they probably will leave in place the legislative language, which is the management of the program, which will mean we'll have to go back to the table and start all over again. And I think that's really what we ought to have to do.
As we look at the polls and you talk about what Americans are feeling now with the presidential election coming up this November, it seems like we're in for a very tight race in the general elections between President Obama and Mitt Romney. Do you believe whenever you see polls, do you ever even look at them? Do you put much stock into them?
Well, polls are like opinions. Everybody's got one, but the only one that really matters is the one that counts, and that's on November the 6th when the people of the United States go to the polls and vote. My message to all Georgians is this is a year where we need all hands on deck. We need everybody turning out to vote. We need a massive turnout like we had in 1980. This is our country, and it is a great country, and we own it, we the voters. We're going to go the direction the voters send us, but if not very many people turn out, that direction might not be good. So I urge everybody in Valdosta and South Georgia and around the state to learn the issues, follow the candidates, and turn out and vote their passion and their conviction.
I will tell our listeners, if you have questions for Senator Isakson, his website that lists a lot of the things that he has done, a lot of the legislation he has worked on and spoken about, and also there's a lot of contact information at Isakson, ISAKSON.senate.gov. You can find out a lot of ways to get in touch with the senator and his staff and voice your concerns and voice your ideas. And I know, Senator, you like to hear from your constituents because that's where you get a lot of your ideas from.
Well, that's right. I represent them, and I want to hear from them. We get about 1.2 million emails a year, and we get lots and lots of phone calls, and that's what we want, to get good input. But let me add, Chris, that we also have a full staff in our state to serve the people on issues like passports, on issues like Medicare, on issues like Medicaid, military records, things of that nature, IRS problems, Social Security disability. So if you have any problem with any entity in the government or what the government functions with in terms of you, do not hesitate to call our offices. We'll be more than happy to help in any way that we can.
And, Senator, we do appreciate that. And finally, as a University of Georgia graduate, the dogs be okay this fall?
I think we got a good two breaks. One is we haven't had too many people punished so far this year, which is a good thing, although we had a couple of disciplinary problems. And secondarily, very honestly, we have a pretty light schedule for an SEC schedule. So if we were ever going to have a year where things were in the right place for Georgia to win big, it's going to be this year.
UGA and GOP this fall, that'd be a good combination. So
that'd be a great combination.
Senator Isakson, thank you so much for joining us this morning. We appreciate it.
Great to be with you, Chris. Thank you.